Let's take some questions in the audience, please. We have a few more arms up. In the front row here, please. We'll take 4 or 5 in one go. Please.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about, well, sort of leading on Daniel's question about whether we're talking about behavior change or regime change, and I think that that really is the fault line in terms of the decision-making and the realities in the heads of people in Europe and people in the US. But I guess one of the things that has been written about, from long-time Iran watchers has been sort of, what would sort of bring Iran to the table in a serious way to abandon enrichment, right? We're not even talking about nuclearization and weaponry, but about enrichment. And the suggestion there has been, and I'm coming back to Fawaz's point, really is that option about direct bilateral contacts between the US and Iran rather than the kind of the coalition setup for negotiations that we have here? And is that enough of an incentive? Again, broadening the basket issues beyond the nuclear issue, would that sort of present a more appetizing incentive to Tehran? But also in Tehran, if I could actually put a question to Roxanne, sure, the capacity to have nuclear technology is sort of seen as a sovereign right, seen so across both sides of, all sides of the political spectrum. But I'm wondering, where does the real sort of impetus, if there is one, for weaponization, where does that come from? Because it does seem to me that there is a fault line whereby you might have actually the more conservative religious establishment not buying into weaponization, but people like Ahmadinejad who might. And I'm wondering kind of if you could speak to that issue.
Great question. In the very back there's someone in a white shirt.
There seem to be 3 options being discussed: do nothing, bomb, and sanctions. I'm just wondering, a couple of years ago, we saw lots of Iranians demonstrating. I think it was called the Green Revolution, and they've all been suppressed quite brutally since. I'm just wondering what everyone on the panel thinks one of those demonstrators would want the international community to do out of those 3 options if they were sitting here today.
Great question. Let's see. There.
Thank you. I've got a really simple question. We seem to be talking a lot about stopping Iran developing the bomb. Does the panel believe that we can stop Israel bombing Iran?
Okay. Yeah. Does the panel believe that Israel can be stopped from bombing Iran? Please.
Yeah. Very simple question. Obviously not for you, Mark. But it looks like the sanctions are not working, or people are very against the sanction. Bombing, obviously everybody wants to avoid it. So I'd like to ask Daniel, Roxanne, and Fawaz what they would recommend and what works.
Sorry, the question is what works in terms of...
What works? If we are against the sanction,
if you're against sanctions, what would you do?
Then what works?
Okay, let's take 2 more. Right here in the front.
To Daniel's point about a rogue element within your point about a rogue element within the Israeli government, how credibly can the Netanyahu regime continue to threaten war with Iran if Obama doesn't lose the next election?
So what was the last part?
How can the Netanyahu regime credibly continue to threaten war with Iran unless Obama loses the next election?
Okay. We'll take 1 more in this round. In the back, there's a gentleman in the white shirt. Yep.
So it's a question to Mark. I've got a bit of a pessimistic view, having lived both here and in Iran, that the Iranian people have this mentality that if there is going to be a regime change, it should be the Iranian people who do it, and that it doesn't matter. It's not about democracy. It's not about security. It's just because we pissed the Americans off. And at the end of this whole thing, even if Iran gives up its nuclear rights and so forth, is it a case that we might not make friendship with America and continue to not be friends and piss them off, and you would sit there and continue to hate the Iranian regime? What's going to happen in the future?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of directing of these, and I'd like the panelists and Max to come in as well and try to, in the last 15, 20 minutes we have, try to give the audience a sense in your answers, not that they should therefore become very long, But in your answers, a sense of what do you think the right way forward is in the question of Iran's relationship really with the outside world, whether it's about engagement, whether it's about the nuclear program, whether it is obviously a sense in which Iran has sat outside the international order for the last 30 years in various ways, self-inflicted and clearly also through other means. But I think if we could start with the first question in terms of behavior change versus regime change, and Roxanne, maybe you could start on this. The question of enrichment and whether there is something that would prompt them to abandon that, but really also more fundamentally, where is the impetus for weaponization coming from, if there is one that is strong enough to take Iran close to the edge?
I'd like to take the issue of the impetus first. One of the things that happened in Iran was that when the nuclear enrichment began, the business was parceled out and it metastasized. And a great number of the different organizations that took it on included the Revolutionary Guard and several of their different components. And so it actually has become an ingrained and very difficult to manage industry inside Iran. It's a real case of a military-industrial complex. And that is one of the difficulties that Iran encounters in having to anticipate or even imagine what it would be to ratchet it down. In terms of the actual impetus, I think the question's really well put. I think that it has always been known that one of the things about Iran is that it is a gorgon with many heads, and that certainly Khamenei can pass many fatwas while other members of the government or non-governmental institutions could certainly be behind covert weaponization or sending off one particular line that might direct that particular project. So I think it's very difficult to read the tea leaves as to which one of these it might be, but I think it's very possible that there are groups inside Iran that with semi-official or unofficial sanction are actually pursuing this within this large complex. I would say that to answer one of the other sideline questions before giving up my claim to 10 minutes, I get back to the question, why do we hate them? And I would say that the answer that you gave would perfectly describe a number of American allies too, such as Saudi Arabia. So that's clearly not the problem. The problem is trust. Why do we engage in all of this? Because neither Iran nor the United States trusts each other at all. And this is the problem. This is always the problem in geostrategic relations. And until that trust is overcome, it will always be wrong-sized, a wonderful term, and I like that a lot. Why does the Syria negotiations not take place? Why, for example, there was a previous one, a great opportunity. There is a problem with drugs coming across the Afghan border into Iran. That drug wall that's being kept by Iran is a typical dam that will break at one point or another, and the main place that it will land is Europe. So Europe has a very good reason to be negotiating with Iran to try to hold that line against Afghan drugs. And yet, time and again, the Iranians feel as though there is no real trust in the negotiations, even over something so critical to the well-being of Europe. And this is the type of thing we certainly see coming up in the Syria negotiations or not, and why the nuclear issue is such a major aspect. It's because of the trust. And indeed, that is one of the things that Saudi Arabia has weighed in, just to be sure that we all know that there will be an arms race. It's said if Iran gets the nuclear weapon, we're going to be forced into it too, just to dot that I.
Okay, thank you. I think Mark and then Max, both of you, I think would be great to hear from you both on the question of the U.S.-Iran relationship and the regime change question. At the end of the day, as most people I think here understand, this is going to be resolved between the United States and Iran in very large measure, much more so than with Israel or with the Arab neighbors of Iran, given the strengths of antipathy and the love-hate relationship between those two countries. But Mark, to those questions and to the broader question of what to do, just a few thoughts from you, and then we'll go to Max after that.
Well, I'm pleased to be in London defending the Obama administration's Iran policy from criticism from Danny and from our European friends, because I think that there's a misunderstanding of the president's Iran policy. The notion that somehow he's been captured by a coalition of, neocon, Zionists, right-wingers who've basically seized his mind, and that what he really wanted to do was talk, and he wasn't really interested in pressure, is a complete mischaracterization of the president's policy. The president generally engaged Iran from the beginning. It's a policy that I supported. He also, at the same time, recognized that in any negotiation, you need a pressure track. And he began to ramp up the sanctions. And I think that he has tried, in fits and starts, to move both of those tracks along. I think that we are in a situation today where we've spent an hour and a half blaming the administration, blaming the Israelis, blaming the Europeans. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the reason that we have no negotiated settlement today is that Iran has been unwilling to meet its obligations under 6 UN Security Council resolutions, numerous IAEA reports that are very clear about what Iran's obligations are. Suspend enrichment, give up nuclear weapons activities, ship out your uranium, and sign on to the additional protocol of the NPT. That has been very clear. Now, President Obama is concerned about Iran not because he's been captured by a bunch of neocon Zionists. He is concerned because his whole worldview on proliferation is very profound. The president becomes very emotional on this issue. And he understands the cascade of proliferation that will occur if Iran goes nuclear, the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, and others go nuclear. His horror scenario is a nuclear-armed Middle East with multiple countries with their fingers on a hair trigger. That is a grave threat to American national security. That's what concerns the president. Let me just quickly move to the issue of regime change. I think Danny has put this binary choice. It's a false choice. Okay, it's not a question of behavior change or regime change. It's actually a question of how do you convince Khamenei that you will take down his regime unless he changes his behavior? Because nothing else will change his behavior. He has no other reason to give up his nuclear weapons program unless you put him to the choice. And what I'm suggesting, and I think what the administration is following, is that we will use sanctions and we will use diplomatic pressure to ratchet up the pressure on this man and on his regime and put him to a fundamental choice, that if he meets his international obligations, his regime will survive. If it doesn't survive, all instruments of US power, including the military option, which President Obama has made repeatedly clear is on the table, can be used or will be used in furtherance of that goal. And I think it is a mistake and a mischaracterization for anybody to say that this is not something that the president, as commander-in-chief of the United States, is committed to on his own and would do on his own even if Israel wasn't a factor. So again, what should be done? We should continue the negotiations. We should ratchet up the sanctions. We should look at any opportunity, any space to reach a negotiated settlement. I'm skeptical that it's going to happen. Like many of you, I doubt sanctions will be the silver bullet, but we should try. But we are running out of time. And what my friends are very optimistic, but what they're fighting against is physics, not ideas. And the physics are the centrifuges spinning, the enriched uranium that is stockpiling, and the time on the clock that is ticking down. That's the physics. And if you're concerned about a nuclear-armed Iran, you should be concerned about the physics. That's what we're dealing with. That's why it's a concern, and that's why it can't be downsized. It is a major concern because the physics are overwhelming everything else.
Okay, thank you. Danny, there were 2 questions on the Israeli angle of that. Do you want to talk both about can Israel be deterred? And at the end of the day, if this comes to war, it'll not be because the United States takes unilateral action, certainly not this president. It'll be because Israel does.
I'm just a little nervous as to the... I'm not going to be glib about it. Mark Dubowitz. You are easily Googleably quoted as saying the following: designing sanctions to make Khamenei relent is a delusion. That's what you said. Let's own our politics. Don't sell us something that you have called a delusion.
Well, wait a second. That
Mark,
actually, you're
Mark,
misquoting
Mark,
me.
I'm not misquoting.
You're misquoting me.
Look, thankfully we have Google these days.
You're misquoting me.
Look up the word Mark Dubowitz delusion. I don't know whether it will be 1 million hits or one
And I'll
hit.
tell you what,
But you can Google Mark Dubowitz delusion.
And like
Ask
everything
your
else,
question.
read the piece, not the paragraph. Read the piece, not the paragraph.
I invite you to read
It's
the
always
entire
good to read
piece.
the piece,
Yes,
not the paragraph.
Yes, I'm sure I'm taking that kind of a phrase out of context because it's
Danny,
so
let's get-
decontextualizable.
Danny, let's get to the question.
Danny,
No,
you're
I
a good
mean,
reader.
that-
Read the piece, not the
because
paragraph.
there's an important point here. Two people taking part in this debate, and I have my politics, I own my politics, I'm not ashamed of my politics. Two people in this debate are part of an institutional setup. You weren't around at the time. I don't know what you were doing. Our other guest, and it's a shame we can't also debate the points that Mr. Boot would be raising. Could we hear them? A part of a set of institutional structures that have not seen a Middle Eastern war that they didn't like. In fact, Mr. Boot has suggested that we might have to occupy the Saudi oil fields for a period of time. So it's important not to pretend that people are experts. They come from a political place, not just a place of expertise. As to your question, Nader. Look, I've got to admit that my bottom line is that I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to undertake a unilateral action. I can't get into his head, and I don't want to indulge in pop psychology. Sometimes, when I hear his Holocaust analogies, I almost feel he's in a tug of war with himself. It's very interesting. If I did just a survey, don't think, just put up your hands. How many people think there have been more significant military adventures under the 6+ years, in 2 terms now, that Netanyahu has been prime minister, or when the most recent Labour and centrist leaders, Barak and Olmert, have been prime ministers? You probably think, well, that's taken place under Netanyahu. No. The man is very risk averse. We've had no adventurism I'm not a fan of the policies. That probably hasn't come through yet. But we have not had the kind of Lebanon or Gaza military actions that you saw under other prime ministers. It's very interesting. He is actually risk averse. And I think all his political instincts push in a certain direction. So a big part of the answer is, I'm not at all sure. Look, I think Netanyahu wants, pretty similar to where you are, either something that ultimately economically strangles the Iranian regime or provokes the Iranian regime. I don't think it's coincidental that earlier on tonight you used the phrase economic warfare, or a military action taken by someone else. Now, were he to overcome the risk aversion, or if we were to detect that that's where it's going, I do think there are things, and I think the Obama administration in this aspect is making rather a good fist of it. I think they're using the military-to-military relationship to caution. I think they are making it difficult for the Prime Minister of Israel to move further in that direction. I think there are other things that Europeans can do. I think we should be talking more with his coalition allies, because I actually think we should be explaining our position and explaining our reservations. Actually, one of, if not my biggest concern, if this goes to a military strike, is what this does for Israel. And not necessarily to worst case scenario, the immediate fallout, but I think the long-term trajectory for Israel's resilience in the region is something that I'm deeply, deeply concerned about if Israel makes what I consider to be the terrible mistake of a military strike. But I do think there are things that one can do, and I think some of them are being done to make that less likely. One last word. I wouldn't like the takeaway from this to be that the options are bomb, sanction, or do nothing. And I think all three of us would have a whole range of things that do not fall into the first two categories, or at least are far more targeted, limited, and specific in the latter category, and that do fall into the do something category.
Actually, 4 of us. 4 of us. I occasionally can get creative and think of other things that I would do besides bomb or sanction, but
Great, 4 of us. We'll see.
maybe
We'll
even
see
5
what.
of us or 6 of us. I mean, I think we all probably
I'm
have
the
thought of a
neutral
few
chair.
other things,
Okay.
but not to mischaracterize.